Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Zoom meeting on social impact capital in Florida's opportunity zones. This is Gila Ferguson with the Florida Philanthropic Network. We're all very excited that you could join us today. And we'd like to thank the Florida Housing Coalition for agreeing to present this very important information for us. One little housekeeping note, if we could ask anybody who is not presenting today to please mute yourselves. That way we won't hear any background noise and get distracted. We will have some time for Q&A at the end of the session, and please feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question, or if you have questions during the session, please use the chat box, and Johnny from FPN and myself will be monitoring that. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Ben.
Thanks so much, Gila. I really appreciate that. And I do want to just start off by asking for a confirmation you can hear me. The audio's coming through fine. Everything good?
All looks good on my end, Ben.
All righty, great. It's important to check first. So thanks again. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak with this audience. Florida Housing Coalition is, we'll be honest, pretty transparent about our firm belief that the foundation space, whether you're a community foundation, a private foundation, whatever you may be, you can really play an outsized role in the opportunity zones incentive and making it a policy success in the state of Florida. So our discussion here today, it's titled Social Impact Capital in Florida's Opportunity Zones. So yes, we are going to be talking about the opportunity zone incentives. And specifically, we're going to be talking about how foundations can really plug into the space and overcome some of the inherent deficiencies and challenges that are built into this opportunity zone program so that it really does make a positive social impact in the community that you care about, whatever it may be. So the opportunity zones conversation is pretty heated right now. If you are at all familiar with affordable housing, community development, housing finance, you have probably heard about the Opportunity Zone incentive. And I think that that excitement is warranted. It is exciting because it is incentivizing investment from a new investor type into the community development and affordable housing space. For so many decades, we have been working with government through grants or loan security or just investment in subsidies and affordable housing at the local level. Or we've been working with investors, large institutional investors, maybe it's a bank or an insurance company in the tax credit space. And you can see the results of that in the low-income housing tax credit as the most productive vehicle for affordable housing development in our history. But all of that investment hasn't done the trick, and we need more capital. We're losing the fight in affordable housing development. It's a real crisis in the nation, and we need more investment. So we are excited as an industry about opportunity zones and bringing in that new investor class. It really can be a game changer. But all of that said, there are some real challenges here. And because there is this new investor type, we need to start doing a lot of groundwork, a lot of infrastructure building. We need to be connecting good projects, whether it's investment in an existing business on Main Street, or whether it's a real estate deal, affordable housing, multifamily project, whatever it may be. We need to be connecting those good projects that are financially strong, but also represent real positive social impact with actual investors, with capital gains. So we need to be building those connections. And at the same time, we need to be building connections within the community to the investors and to the projects. So there's an incredible amount of hard work that needs to be done here. And we believe, the Florida Housing Coalition believes that the foundation space can play a huge role in building those connections and overcoming some of the concerns about displacement. So we're not just going to be talking theoretically about the role of foundations. My colleague Sean Nesbitt and I today are going to be modeling Kresge and Rockefeller Foundation efforts that have really been pushing the charge in the opportunity zone space at the national level. We're going to be breaking down the constituent bits, the activities that they are doing, and showing you how those activities could be deployed at the local level. So let's just get started. You knew this was coming. The Florida Housing Coalition, we are a statewide nonprofit. We've been around since 1982 doing this work, and we work to ensure that there is a sufficient supply of affordable housing in every community in the state of Florida. And that takes a lot of hard work. We do that through three main ways. One is training. Believe it or not, we do a good amount of training. The second is policy work. We are in Tallahassee advocating for full funding of the Sadowski Housing Trust Fund, if you're familiar with that. And we also focus on strategy, pivoting to strategic opportunities and making sure that the right connections are built so that those opportunities can be deployed in communities around the state. So when you talk about those three things that we do since 1982, the Opportunity Zones is really at the center of those three. Today, I am joined by my colleague, Sean Nesbitt. He's on the left there. He's just a superstar. He has a really deep background. He worked for local government, administering programs. He worked for a tax credit developer in the Tampa area, and he even worked in finance. So his skill set is broad, and it's a pleasure working with him every day. And that's me on the right there. I'll leave it at that. If for whatever reason you want to contact us, if you want to continue this discussion, here is some contact information. That's my cell number. Feel free to give it a call. My email is also there. Happy to talk. Okay, let's jump into it here. The Opportunity Zones incentive is so new that we always run the risk of leaving people behind if they aren't necessarily totally caught up on what it is. So yes, we do have some fundamental 101 of what Opportunity Zones are in this. So let me just jump in here. The first fundamental component that I'd like to highlight for you is this 6 trillion. And I double check a number of zeros in that. 6 trillion is the sort of top line headline number that was coming out in news releases as the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed about the pool of available unrealized capital gains in the United States. And I've seen some other numbers, but once you're talking about 6 trillion, that's such a huge number that it doesn't really matter the specifics at that point. So we're not saying that $6 trillion is coming into the Opportunity Zone market. It's just the broad universe of capital that can apply in this case. So that, again, is why the community development industry is so excited about this and also so worried about some of the potential displacement issues that are inherent in it. Okay, so that's the 6 trillion. The capital gains is critical. The Opportunity Zones incentive is a tax incentive for capital gains. If you are an investor without capital gain liability, this probably isn't the space for you. So we really need to be identifying high net worth individuals, maybe a corporation with some capital gains on its books. But without capital gains, you're probably not going to be in this conversation from an investment specifically into qualified opportunity funds perspective. And again, the final fundamental component here is equity. An investment into a qualified opportunity fund, and then from the fund level into qualified opportunity zone businesses, and the investment into some project, whether it's real estate, whether it's an existing business, that investment is going to come in the form of equity. So you will be holding some equity stake in the project, whatever that project may be. So again, that raises a whole host of concerns about who will ultimately benefit from these investments going forward. And we can see a lot of really creative things being developed at the transaction level, where commitments are being made on the front end to alleviate some of the concerns of the exit of the investors after 10 years or so. So there's a lot of space for maneuver here. But again, there is an equity position in an operating business or in a real estate project, for instance. So again, these are just fundamental components. On the incentive side, so I keep saying the opportunity zone incentive, what are the actual incentives? That's listed here. So the first incentive for investors is deferral. They are able to defer payment on a capital gain, their capital gain tax liability, up to December 31st, 2026. So that raises an issue of the end of this year, December 31st, 2019, there is a bit of a deadline to maximize the benefits of the incentive for investors, because they want to defer their capital gain liability as far into the future as possible. So there is that cutoff of December 31st, 2026. Now, the 5, 7, 10 are scaling benefits to the investor based on the amount of time that they have invested and they hold their position in a fund, okay? So at 5 years, if an investor holds their investment for 5 years or more, they're going to get a 10% basis boost on that investment. So they're lowering their liability for capital gains tax, okay? Similarly, if they hold for 7 years or more, that basis boost goes up to 15%. And then finally, the 10 there is the real home run for an investor. If you as an investor hold in the fund for 10 years or more, 100% of the capital gain is excluded from tax liability. So if, for instance, you invest in real estate and you hold that property for 10 years, you buy it for $1 million, you sell it for $10 million after the 10 years, the difference there, you're not going to pay 1 cent of capital gains tax on that increased appreciated value of the property. So that's the real home run. So when you're looking at these numbers, from an investor's perspective, they're going to be in a position in this fund for a long time. So we need to be finding folks with capital gains, and we need to be finding those folks with capital gains who are patient and willing to invest in a community over the long term in the hopes of really realizing some strong returns on their investment, both socially and from a financial perspective. Just plugging along here, let me talk very briefly about opportunity zones themselves. These are geographic locations. These are census tracts identified. They're written in stone statutorily. It would require an act of Congress to revise the designations at this point. So we know where they are, and we know who's living in them. There are 427 of these designated opportunity zones in the state of Florida, 1 in each county. So no matter where you are in the state, there is an opportunity zone somewhat close to you. We also know that the residents living in these opportunity zones are more vulnerable to housing displacement in particular. And I'm not just saying that, for fun. There are facts here that back that up. So in the following slides, I'm just going to show you some of the facts around that vulnerability. So in each case, there is Florida and all of the census tracts in Florida compared to all of the census tracts that are designated opportunity zones. So the unemployment rate in OZs is essentially double the statewide. The median household income significantly lower compared to the state. Educational attainment in terms of high school degree attainment, significantly lower in opportunity zones. This story continues. Cost burden, rental housing cost burden, higher in opportunity zones. Okay, so all of that, this data framework of the concern around what kind of investments are going to be coming into these opportunity zones, backed up by this data. And in fact, when you look at census tracts in all of Florida, you find that 116 of the opportunity zones are the highest or the worst in the state for unemployment, cost burden rental units, the lowest median household income, and the lowest high school degree attainment or more. So these are highly vulnerable communities. And in fact, if you're familiar with the fair housing world, 83 opportunity zones are racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. So these are communities that have faced long-term underinvestment, long-term undercapitalization, and they're really desperate and hungry for good projects with good investors that are backed and supported by the community. One last point on this is just a nod to redlining. Yes, many of these communities that are designated opportunity zones have suffered from decades of underinvestment through legal mechanisms like redlining and the Homeowners Loan Corporation identifying certain communities that are not eligible for loans back in the 30s into the 80s. So there is a long and deep history here, and we have a fantastic opportunity to bring capital to these communities so that we can really revitalize and strengthen housing security and economic development in those communities. So I've touched on a bunch of these concerns. One is focused on the vulnerability of the community residents living in these designated opportunity zones, certainly, but also structurally within the opportunity zone incentive, there are very few reporting requirements. And this has continued in rounds of regulations coming out of the U.S. Treasury as they write the regulations for the incentive. We're expecting one more round that we have heard there will be some mention of reporting requirements in that final round of regulations, but to date there really has not been. At the same time, the Treasury is very focused on the economic development aspect of this incentive. They are not talking about housing displacement. They're not talking about housing security. They are exclusively seeing this as a vehicle for economic development, more jobs, and capital flow. So there absolutely is a concern about reporting. As of right now, we don't necessarily know who is creating the funds. We don't necessarily know what projects they're investing in, and we don't necessarily know what those projects are hoping to achieve. And because, to that second bullet point, project types, because there are no firm guidelines for the types of projects that can benefit from opportunity zone investment, this can be conversions from market rate multifamily apartments to luxury condos. That certainly qualifies under the regulations as they're currently designed. It can be external equity coming into an existing business, forcing that business owner's hand who might not be fully familiar with the ins and outs of the contract that they're signing, and then ultimately after 10 years, they might lose their position in the business. So there are all kinds of nuances and challenges here because the project type guidelines, there are no guardrails here. There really are not. So there are concerns about the project that might be coming in. And we are already seeing, I can confirm, that in certain communities, designated opportunity zones in the state, we're seeing rising housing costs far higher than neighboring communities that are not opportunity zones. So private capital is coming in. The value of parcels in opportunity zones is already spiking. So we, as a community, we really need to be focused on building an infrastructure and building a framework for how we can invest in these communities and really lift them up. Now, finally, I do want to mention there is a concern about there being no results from this, okay? I mentioned that many of these are redlined communities. Many of these census tracts are historically underinvested from a capital perspective. So a real concern here is that projects are not sourced in those communities. new housing won't come in, new businesses won't receive the capital that they need, simply because no one is aware. The local stakeholders don't have the technical expertise to get something done. Maybe there's a project that is borderline from a financing perspective, and it just needs a little bit of a push. And the opportunity zone incentive can really provide that equity to push that sort of borderline project to a green light. And maybe if that community isn't aware of the opportunity here, they won't take advantage of it. And then the capital won't come in, that project won't be made. So we really want to make sure that the capital is sourced and connected to good projects. No investment is not a good outcome either. So those are some of the concerns. That's the 101, the basic framework here. And for the remainder of this conversation, I'm actually going to turn it over to my colleague, Sean Nesbitt. And what we're going to do here is talk about a specific model that is active now, that is being deployed now, that addresses many of the fundamental challenges and concerns that we have in opportunity zones. And we're going to talk about that model and talk about how it can be deployed in Florida. So Sean, are you ready to go?
I am ready to go. Thank you, Ben, for that fantastic background and really setting the stage and making the case for the importance of impact investing and impact investors in opportunity zones. We're going to start off talking about the work of a couple of foundations at the national level, and we're going to describe their work, and this is Rockefeller and Kresge. And as our hope is that as we talk about what they've done at the national level, we'll be able to tease out and you can see some of the roles that you all can play here in Florida and kind of replicate, if you will, what they've done at the national level, which is very comprehensive, but really detailed about 4 roles that we think foundations can play here in Florida to accomplish some of the goals that we've talked about so far. Okay, next slide. So, of course, Rockefeller and Kresge need no introduction, but in 2018, these two foundations came together in an effort to support investment strategies that really advance inclusive community development and expanded access to quality jobs and other means of economic mobility within opportunity zones. And this is, of course, right after the Act went into law. And they really wanted to support strategies that also support their programmatic goals. Kresge and Rockefeller have certain geographic focuses. For instance, Kresge has a focus in Detroit and Memphis and New Orleans, and Rockefeller has their own programmatic goals. And so the two came together, and in June of last year, they jointly issued requests for letters of intent from fund managers at a nationwide level that would implement these investment strategies that advance their purposes. And they received, according to Kresge and Rockefeller, over 150 letters of inquiry. And at the time, it should be noted that Rockefeller and Kresge, they were making no financial commitments. And they specifically said in the request, and you can download this request from Rockefeller's website if you want to go see the actual language of it, but that they were making no financial commitments as to, you know, what they would do, but the letters that they received would inform or kind of describe how they should make those types of commitments. And so they ended up choosing 2 fund managers to work with, Artaris and Community Capital Management. Some of you may be familiar with Community Capital Management as they're headquartered in Broward County. This particular effort is going to be run out of their Boston office, but I thought that was pretty cool. We have a Florida connection there. And then Artaris is also headquartered in Boston. And combined with the 2, Rockefeller and Kresge, they're making a total of $22 million commitment to these funds There's 15 million commitment to Artaris and 7 million commitment to community capital management. And this will be mainly in the form of first loss guarantees on their opportunity funds. And really, as one of the first actors in what Rockefeller and Kresge saw this as a way to entice further investment as a first loss actor in this space. And they're expecting quite a bit of further investment to occur. And these will be in a 10-year term. And in addition to the financial commitment, the funds would receive what they're calling brand equity, in that investors investing into those opportunity funds would know that these are in partnership with Rockefeller and Kresge. And so that just kind of lends further credibility, further excitement about being involved in a national effort. And so, and also Rockefeller and Kresge will also partner with the fund to promote the fund. And so knowing that these endeavors are supported by these well-known foundations would attract further investment. Next slide. So in exchange for these guarantees, the firms had to agree to what they're called financial and social covenants that promote the foundation's community development and wealth building and economic mobility goals. And so Kresge has published this term sheet for their guarantees on their website. So if you go to Kresge Foundation's website, you can download this term sheet and see exactly what those covenants are. And so these covenants include things such as the requirement that the funds impanel a non-governing advisory board. And this advisory board has to meet at least twice a year. It has to include representatives from the low-income community that receiving the investment, or organizations that serve that low-income community. And this board has to provide insights as to the fund's actual impact on the community. One thing I also thought was interesting is that they said they're requiring the fund to clearly and openly identify as an opportunity fund in its marketing materials. I thought that was interesting, considering the advantage, or folks knowing what the tax advantage would be, that they would have no problems, but maybe there's some still things happening where people aren't identifying as opportunity funds. So I just thought that was very interesting that they had that requirement there as one of the covenants. Another thing, for residential real estate, they're requiring at least 50% at the fund level of all multifamily housing to serve residents of incomes not exceeding 120% of that area's median income. And that's at the fund level. At the project level, no project can serve less than 20% of their units fee for incomes not exceeding 120% of AMI. So at the project level, at least 20% must be affordable, and fund level, at least 50% of all the units must be for affordable housing. If there's an investment that involves acquisition of occupied residential, as Ben was just talking about, to address displacement, the fund has to have a written anti-displacement strategy in place for anything that involves acquisition and rehab. Even further, for operating businesses, at least 50% of the portfolio investments must create a net positive number of living wage jobs. And one last example of the covenants is that they must adhere to the reporting requirements, one of the other concerns that Ben expressed. And these reporting requirements are both at the fund level and the project level. And it's quarterly and annually, and they have certain metrics that they're measuring. And so these covenants and the metrics are largely based on Rockefeller and Kresge's work with new market tax credit investments. And they also took some from what's known as the Opportunity Zone framework And there's a whole website on that, ozframework.org. And this was a system of metrics and reporting requirements, has been, would say, just kind of optional at this point, but hoping that folks take on and adopt. And this was developed by the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance. The Beek Center at Georgetown University and other partners came together that developed this framework. And Rockefeller and Kresge have taken a lot of that and put into their covenants within their term sheet for their investments. And just some of the types of investments that community capital and Artaris are targeting. With regard to affordable housing, they're really targeting to do mixed use affordable housing. Community capital specifically was looking at housing that involved, space for artists to create their products and also sell and display in gallery space. So that's specifically around affordable housing, mixed use. Other things include investments in the sustainable architecture and building food systems in urban areas, manufacturing and other existing businesses, as well as infrastructure. This was something that Artaris brought up that they're looking to do, building on solar and broadband in communities where, it's currently lacking. So that's one of their targets as well. So varying types of investments, as Ben mentioned, once again, a lot of it related to creating jobs, but definitely includes affordable housing within those targeted investments. Next slide. So in addition to investments directly with opportunity funds, both Rockefeller and Kresge have done what we call kind of market building activities. And Rockefeller, even at the same time as they were doing these letters of inquiry, created the Opportunity Zone Community Capacity Building Initiative. And this was a $5.5 million investment by Rockefeller into 6 cities. Newark, New Jersey is the first city that's been chosen recently, and the others will be announced as this year goes by. And each city is going to receive 2 years of funding, which will include the creation of what they're calling a Chief Opportunity Zone Officer, which would be embedded into local government to basically guide and implement local government strategies as to what they would like to see happen in opportunity zones, and kind of shepherd over, transactions, and, really making sure that local goals are being met, economic development goals are being met by opportunity zone investments. In addition to that position, they will also receive community engagement specialists to really engage the community and educate residents of the communities that are going to be receiving these investments as to what opportunity zones are, what it means for their community, what it means for their business owner, how they can benefit property owners. So everyone really understands what this is all about and what it's supposed to do. And I think this is a great example of how a foundation is really building the market for what should be happening in communities at the ground level. Kresge Foundation also did something similar with their OZ Incubator program, and they are providing technical assistance to 5 organizations in different communities throughout the nation that are exploring opportunity zone funds. And so these are, again, 2 examples of market building activities that Rockefeller and Kresge are doing in addition to the actual providing of seed capital. And so here, I think if you look at what Rockefeller and Kresge are doing, we really see that there are kind of 4 roles, 4 key things that they're doing that we think foundations can do at the state and local level. The first thing being a market builder, that's, providing the capital to do capacity building, even seeding persons within organizations that are impact investment minded to kind of guide the process and really building that infrastructure of human capital to see that the investments actually make the impact that they should. They're also providing, direct seed capital into funds. And with that, they're able to drive policy in exchange for, receiving those investments. We want to have certain outcomes. And just being kind of a first actor in the space, some of the things that they're doing are really innovative and really going to set the tone for what other organizations do in the future. Next slide. So just want to talk briefly about the first role as a market builder. And these are just to give some examples, some things to think about as you're thinking about what your foundation could do. The first thing, education and community engagement. I'm sure you've seen, especially this calendar year, so many opportunities, and we keep using that word, to attend events to get educated on the opportunities on investment. Attorneys, accountants, other fund managers, everyone's kind of doing these events, but still we find that there's not enough education and not enough understanding in the community, particularly those directly in those affected communities, to understand the opportunity zone incentive. And so really thinking about how we can educate the community and get the communities involved that are going to be receiving these investments, or that should be standing to benefit from them, is really important. And so that education still needs to take place. Also, sourcing investors and projects on the investor side, those individuals that are investing with your foundation that may be socially minded. You all have access to those, as well as the projects and understanding, your direct connection to the community and nonprofits that you are working with, and you know those projects that are in need of investment, and making that connection between investors and projects is key to building the market for opportunity zone investment. And one key activity is funding a local perspective. And what a lot of communities are doing is putting together a really marketing material on why making an investment in opportunity zones in our community is a good investment. And, this is what's happening in our community. These are some specific opportunities that are available. These are some additional incentives that can be matched with your investment to make it even better. And what you see there is a image from Kansas City. This is an opportunity zone in perspective that was funded in part by the Kauffman Foundation as an example. And if you go to that website, you can see what's within that perspective, and they really break down all of the opportunity zones and the opportunities for investment in the projects that are happening, and some of the expected returns that you can perhaps expect if you invest in these projects, and what's the funding gaps. These are some of the things that might be covered in those prospectuses. And so this is something that foundations can do to really promote the types of investments that we want to see happen. Next slide. The next role would be seed capital. There's local funds that are developing may need the initial capital infusion to attract other investment. We really like the first loss guarantee example that Rockefeller and Kresge are doing. or other program-related investments that you all may already be doing in projects and businesses that are in opportunity zones to really kind of highlight that. Co-investing in a national fund, and just by example, for our Taurus, the $22 million first loss guarantee from Rockefeller and Kresge, they're planning to use that to attract other like investments. They have a goal of raising $75 million in guarantees from other foundations and other organizations that are interested in making that type of investment. And then they would leverage that for a total of $750 million investment into an opportunity fund. And so just thinking about how you, if that's something that your organization is a position to do, to make that type of investment, whether it's first loss or some other program related investment, to provide that initial infusion of funds. And one key activity, of course, funding for capacity building that can accelerate these local efforts. Just by way of example, Florida Housing Coalition just recently entered into a contract to work with Pompano Beach to do some pre-development activities around sites within opportunity funds, to look at them from a zoning perspective, from a financing perspective, and really kind of do some of that pre-development work to show that these are great investment opportunities that will hopefully attract developers and investments from opportunity funds into those areas. And this is something that foundations could fund as well. And I'll give it back to you, Ben.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about the last two roles that we see modeled through the Kresge and Rockefeller Foundation example. And so the third role here is as policy driver. So we've been talking a lot about a lack of reporting requirements in the statute. We've been talking a lot about the flexibility in project types. We've been talking about the fact that there is this new investor who might not necessarily be intimately familiar with the community development world or the affordable housing world, or even the real estate world. They might not be familiar with what makes for a good project that is financially strong and also delivers social returns on investment. So there are so few guardrails here that this third role of a policy driver, the foundation, whatever your organization may be, you can leverage that position to drive towards specific outcomes. And every foundation is going to have its own particular objectives. You might be interested in improving health outcomes. You might be interested in education outcomes or housing security and anti-displacement efforts, whatever it may be. You can really work at more of a local level with whatever your coverage area is, and start to identify actual outcomes that you're pushing toward and what these opportunity zone investments should be pushing toward. And then, as Sean spoke about, develop a reporting framework. And he mentioned the ozframework.org. I think it's a perfect example of the broad outlines of what a local foundation, private foundation could be asking its investors and the projects that it's working with to follow. So there is that reporting framework. So first, let's identify the outcomes. Then once we've identified the outcomes, let's define some measurable targets and reporting frequency, whether it's once a year or quarterly or both. All of that driving towards some accountability within the system, so that from a policy perspective, we can reasonably say in 10 years down the line, well, we know what capital came in here, we know which projects were done, and here are the outcomes that we realized through that process. So there is that policy drive a role. And then, of course, again, on the policy front, I think that there is an incredible role that the foundation community can play in terms of place-based revitalization. The Opportunity Zones incentive is fundamentally a place-based economic and investment incentive. The designated opportunity zones are literally a place. So we need to be structuring the conversation within these opportunity zones around who are the stakeholders in that place, in that opportunity zone. How can we get them together around the same table or in the same room, talking about similar outcomes that we want? Again, maybe we want health outcomes, maybe we want housing security outcomes, whatever it may be. Let's get major employers in that community together. Let's get the local governments together in that room. Let's get the community together in that room and develop a 10-year plan using patient equity through the Opportunity Zones incentive and really drive place-based development. And that broader strategy of a multifaceted effort of place-based revitalization really strengthens the return on investment for investors in a qualified opportunity fund. I mean, just from a theoretical perspective, if you think, okay, this piece of real estate is worth $100,000, the land is worth $100,000, and the built improvement is $50,000. In 10 years, after the local government has been working in concert with major employers, the community, developers, and the investment community, all toward a common outcome, how much is the real estate going to be valued within that community after 10 years? So you're building a stronger return on investment argument for investors using this. So I'll leave it at that. I'd say, again, just using the Rockefeller and Kresge Foundation example, having that investment covenant and identifying, here are the metrics you're reporting. This is the tempo of your reporting, once a year, quarterly, whatever it may be. Establish an advisory board. Let's make sure that we have some accountability attached to our investment, our investors' money coming into these funds. That can go a really long way in building momentum and building trust in a broader place-based revitalization effort. Fantastic space for foundations to work in. Let me touch on that final role of the innovator. We've been talking a lot about the flexibility in this and the lack of guardrails. And that really does lend itself to innovation and creativity. One thing might work in one community and it might not work in another community. The conditions, maybe the housing stock in one neighborhood is entirely single family, so you need a different solution there than solutions that could be deployed in a multifamily kind of high-rise, more downtown environment, right? So we need to be thinking locally and thinking about how we can deploy solutions at the hyper-local level. And foundations can really play an important role in that space by supporting that innovative, creative application of capital, identification of catalytic investments in particular communities that can really spark a broader economic development and housing security revitalization in that community. So the foundation can play an important role there. I would just also mention that in terms of best practices, the foundation, you could be playing a fairly important role in bringing folks together, communicating the best practices that are coming out nationally or locally, bringing in experts who understand the incentive and are working actively in it and are able to communicate the lessons that they've learned along the way so that they can be communicated directly to your stakeholders, whoever you are working with. So that key activity is a fairly basic one, but it can be really transformative if it's done right. Identify stakeholders at the local level who you want to bring together And whether it's a phone call, it doesn't need to be in person, whether it's a phone call, a webinar, or meeting at the local community center on a regular basis and talking about what you're driving toward, the opportunities in the particular opportunity zone area from a real estate perspective, which parcels are vacant, who's the owner, what kind of capital is available. You can really drive some success at the local level by bringing in folks into that forum style of event. At this point, we're going to see if there are any questions, and we will answer them. Are there any questions? And I believe at this point, you can unmute your phone, jump in, start talking, feedback, comments. And I'm going to pause for a really long time. I totally understand when people are muted. Maybe you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed. Maybe this was too much information. But I'll pause for just a minute longer here.
You can also feel free to submit your questions in the chat. You would prefer us to read them to everybody that way.
Okay, you know what? I'm hearing none. And on that front, we really do appreciate this opportunity to chat and have this discussion about what's going on nationally and how those same lessons that we've learned at the national level can be applied at the local level. And again, the Florida Housing Coalition, we are all in on the importance of foundation participation in the Opportunity Zones incentive. We really want this thing to be a success for communities. We don't want a scenario where no capital comes in. We don't want a scenario where too much capital comes in to the sorts of projects that ultimately displace residents living in these communities. There is a lot of ground game running that we can get going here to make sure that this is ultimately a policy success, not just in Florida, but nationally as well. So if you want to continue the discussion, give me an email or a call. And I will just note that there are a couple of events coming up. Sean mentioned that we are working in Pompano Beach, but we're also holding a Palm Beach County OZ Forum on August 15th. Get in touch with me if you would like to participate in that. There are going to be some folks who are working on actual projects present at that session, and we're driving toward this idea of bringing folks together, identifying actual parcels that are ripe for development, and hopefully moving on them as quickly as possible. So that's coming up on August 15th. And then the last note that I'll make here is that our conference, the Florida Housing Coalition Affordable Housing Conference, is coming up August 26th to the 28th. We will have an Opportunity Zone Forum at that, at our conference. We're going to have some national experts. Nova Gradic is going to be there. We will have foundation representation there. We're really excited about that conversation. So we're going to be continuing it there. At this point, unless there are last minute questions, I think we can wrap it up. Sean, do you have any last notes?
I do not.
Alrighty. Well, I just want to say, Ashan and Ben, thank you so much for spending some time with us today and for giving us this amazing overview. As a reminder to everyone, we did record the session today, which will be available on the FPN website in the next couple of days. So if you have fellow employees or fellow philanthropists that missed today's session, please let them know that they can access it from the FPN website. And with that, we will end the meeting, and thanks all so much for joining us today.